as international NGOs, we do inform donors about what kind of programs they ought to do on ground. But the donors always have their policies that they have to feed into through programs and impacts that programs make. So I always find that while dialoguing with donors, there's very little margin of flexibility in terms of who and where they fund. And at the end of the program, the impact usually goes, and that's my experience, to feed the political stands and foreign policies of donor countries, rather than needs and rights of the communities. And this is always, I would say it's always a dilemma as managing programs on how to create the balance between keeping donors happy, having the impact that's required, but doing something that on ground really is needed, and it's rights and needs based and not donor-led.
The question that we would like to enter more, we try to understand more, is what is the relationship between, generally, in a more broader sense, what is the relationship between development aid and foreign policies? So why generally the countries do that? When do they give a reciprocal added value, or when they actually contrast each other? I mean, in a very broad perspective. And also without one solution, without an approach. Just saying some countries have this approach, some other countries have this approach. Some people say this should be done, other people say no, it should be done differently. Just an overall perspective, so that people like her who are on the field are able to understand better why the donors want us to lead the programs sometimes in a direction which may not be sustainable, or sometimes may even be counterproductive.
I think the one thing that's happening, though, is that we are forgetting that the aid that is given by the countries who are giving the aid actually has another audience as well, and that is the population of the country that is giving it. And it's easier to sell that to the American population, certainly, which is the one that I know the best, if you can say this is helping us with our security goals one way or another. So that's the foreign policy objective, you know. And I have to say, I also had another headache because I was looking online at the New York Times this morning and seeing, and yesterday as well, and there are recent polls around and a lot of activity in the U.S. Congress right now, what with a change to, I shouldn't get into naming the parties, but nevertheless a change to the Republican Party and in the House, and they are very, very upset at the size of the government budget in the United States. And so it appears that when you do polls of the American population, many of them are very, very much in favor of cutting the government budget drastically. And then you ask them, well, do you want to do that by cutting the military? Of course not. Do you want to do that by cutting Social Security? Of course not. Do you want to do that by cutting foreign aid? Absolutely. We want to cut foreign aid. And foreign aid is a minuscule part of the U.S. government's budget right now. You can cut it all out and it still wouldn't change the balance very much. But it's a hard sell, I think, within the United States, in part because it gets attached to a vision of government as being this big, anonymous kind of operation that is wasting money. And I think there's a fear that that's what's happening overseas. And frankly, I think that in many places that has been part of what has been happening overseas, that foreign aid has gone, even when it's very well intentioned, it gets funneled through governments who are very often, not always, but very often in the charge of very, very corrupt politicians who are putting a lot of this into their pockets. I just spent 3 months in Kenya and Tanzania, and that is the raging battle going on there, is just how corrupt are the officials of the government, you know, and what can we do about that? So I do think that that's the problem. My impression, though, is that there's a little bit of good news built in that, but those who have been working on the ground probably know this in a better sense than I would, but that there are a number of things that have a very big payoff in development that don't actually cost that much money. And so one can get some, used to be called bang for the buck, one can get some kind of benefit out of relatively small investments, and there's less there for corrupt politicians to pick off if you do it that way. One of my former students was working in an NGO in Kenya for many years, and one of the things that they did there was to, they actually did random choice. You don't have enough money to aid every village, so let's choose randomly, and some we will give something to and the others we won't, and then we'll do a statistical test to find out, what worked. And one of the things that was best at improving school behavior and school performance of students was giving them worm medicine, because their energies were being sapped by intestinal worms, and if you could kill off those worms, which cost pennies a year, then the students performed a whole lot better. I don't think there are a lot of miracle cures like that out there, but there are some around as well. I think I'm giving a long speech here, I'm sorry, but I think the other thing that is very difficult to convey to audiences that have to be pleased if you're going to still be able to tax them to get the money for foreign aid is to put personal faces on it. And by the time it gets to somebody in a little town in California, let's say, the budget doesn't have a face on it anymore. And I have to say that in some ways, that's the only thing I don't like about the Millennium Goals. They all sound like bureaucrats talking too much, right? And I think the eyes begin to glaze over after a little while as you read that kind of language. But what's behind it is real human suffering, and the chance of doing something about that. If that can be conveyed, maybe that's what your film crews can do, or in novels.
It's also true. I mean, when governments give aid, they need to answer back to their population, which is their taxpayers. And so if it doesn't contribute to, let's say, national security, or it doesn't contribute to national economic development, you're giving money to competitive businesses in developing countries, and you say we're using foreign aid for that, the taxpayer of your country is not happy about it because you're creating competition for him. I also think that governments are not able to bring across the advantage of giving development aid to countries to improve their standards of, let's say, quality of products. So in order to improve standards of the quality of products, you need to do certain technical assistance and standards, and that it's true that it creates competition, but it also creates healthy competition, and maybe they're not able to bring that across. There's I've seen, for instance, the difference between, let's say, USAID programs and Europe-aid programs. So USAID programs fund much more economic development or let's say national security. So they would pay the army of a country through the government. They would give the salaries of the Afghan army, or they give the salaries of the Lebanese army. And when they fund in civil society, they fund economic development. And they don't fund the enabling environment for healthy competition to happen sometimes. So that creates unhealthy competition. While, for instance, but it's important because you're funding economic development, which anyway should come back as it does have a positive impact also on, let's say, social issues, women's empowerment of marginalized populations. Europe-aid, for instance, has a different approach. They put the citizen at the heart of development. So they say, not economic development. Let's try and see what are the dynamics of the society which are counterproductive for development. And let's start working on that rather than working on just economic development. So sometimes the two are complementary.
What are the factors, the non-economic factors?
Like they fund education. So they think that the more people are educated, they themselves will make the choices of the kind of development they want. So we don't have to give money to small businesses to make them perform better, like maybe USAID does. We need to get people to become more capable of choosing for themselves what development they want. Or, for instance, factors like conflict. So they go a lot into conflict resolution or bringing different communities together. Some of the donors, not just USAID, because USAID also does work in this, but some donors, for instance, fund certain communities. So they would fund certain communities in the mountains, let's say, and give them more money. But then they may not fund communities in the mountains with similar problems in another part of the country. and they create a kind of animosity between these communities. Instead of bringing the communities together in one problem, let's say the mountain communities have the problem of protecting the forest resources. Let's not just work with one community to protect their forest resources and utilize it for honey production. Let us fund, let's say, 2-3 communities in the mountains and give them what is important for them to then work together to create, to produce honey. So there are differences in the way donors work. Some create conflict in the country where they work, some create dialogue. But they're complementary ways, and I think what is difficult probably is for donors to bring this across, like you're saying, to their populations, saying how that has actually helped to create a better world in which you also will feel more secure. That actually you don't have to fund Lebanese military to have more peace in America. You have to fund an environment in Lebanon that promotes peace so that you have to pay less to the military.
तो इंडिया में आते हैं ऑर्गेनाइजेशन काम करने के, उनके अपने डिसाइडेड गोल होते हैं कि मुझे कैसे करना है, कैसे नहीं करना, और जो हमारे ग्रास रूट पे ज़रूरत होती है वो कहीं ना कहीं वो चली जाती है, डाइल्यूट हो जाती है। तो मेरा तो ये मानना है कि पहले तो नीड असेसमेंट होना चाहिए कि वहाँ पे ग्रास रूट पे क्या ज़रूरत है, और फिर उसके बाद में इम्प्लीमेंट होना चाहिए। और होता क्या, जब हम फंडिंग एजेंसी के अकॉर्डिंग काम शुरू करते हैं तो वो ऊपर से शुरू करते हैं, ऊपर से जब चीज़ें चलती नीचे तक पहुँचते पहुँचते वो ख़त्म हो जाती है। ज़्यादातर होता है कि हम ये चाहते हैं और होना ये चाहिए आप क्या चाहते हैं, उल्टा, जस्ट उल्टा हमें देखने की ज़रूरत है। और जो हम लोगों ने बेसिक, मेरा जो एक्सपीरियंस है 10 साल का है एनजीओ सेक्टर में काम करने का, वुमेन राइट्स पे, वुमेन डेवलपमेंट का। तो अभी तक के जितने भी प्रोजेक्ट्स हमने किए, जितनी भी सपोर्टिंग ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के साथ किए, उनका ये था कि वो ऊपर से सारी डिज़ाइन होती है, और वो कहीं ना कहीं, चाहे डीएफआईडी का ले लें या यूएसएड का, जैसा कि आप बोल रहे थे, और भी डिफरेंट एनजीओस हैं, किसी के पास सक्सेसफुली मॉडल नहीं है अभी तक। उसका बेसिक रीज़न यही है कि उन्होंने महिलाओं के अंदर कोई इम्प्लीमेंट करने का सक्सेसफुली मॉडल नहीं तैयार किया है। जो हम लोगों ने ये टाटा ट्रस्ट के सपोर्ट से ERW तैयार किया, उसमें बेसिक यही था कि महिलाएं पहले कलेक्ट हों, फिर उनकी नॉलेज बिल्डिंग बहुत ज़रूरी है कि आपको एक्चुअली किस डायरेक्शन में जाना है, और वो अपनी ज़रूरतों को पहचानने लगी कि हमें ज़रूरत क्या है। और अभी तक हमारे भारत सरकार ने भी इसी तरीके से किया, अगर आपको ज़रूरत है तो SHG फॉर्म आपने कर लिया, आपको ज़रूरत है तो आपने क्या कहते HIV एड्स के लिए काम शुरू कर दिया। लेकिन एक्चुअल लोगों की पहले जानकारी बढ़ाना बहुत ज़रूरी है। जब उनकी जानकारी बढ़ेगी तो अपने राइट्स के लिए, अपने डेवलपमेंट के लिए वो खुद आगे बढ़ेंगी, और अभी उनकी जानकारी ही नहीं बढ़ी है और अब हम डेवलपमेंट की हम बात कर रहे हैं, तो मुझे लगता है ये गलत है इस तरीके से।
From what I see, there is a kind of a conflict and a more debate-oriented conversation between foreign policy and development aid. And as a dialogue, what happens is, like the lady was saying, that foreign policies, in a sense, dictate more on international aid. And international aid has to then weave through those policies to kind of achieve its objective in a more healthy or harmonizing, promoting way. How can we enable more dialogue between international cooperation and foreign policy and less debate?
I do think that there's a, how do I put this? There's a certain lack of humility in the aid-giving community when it comes to dealing with the aid recipients and who knows best, you know, and so forth. And I think some of that, I think, comes from the fact that when you're dealing with big government agencies, they want to show that they are getting a lot done for the amount of money that has been given to them, and they think that their experts know what the answers are, and if they put money into that and make the local people adjust to that agenda, then that will give them something to brag about back home, right? And I also think that if you want to do something that is closer to being very small scale rather than something that is very large scale, it needs a lot more people in your bureaucracy to administer it. And that, I think, is one of the limitations. It's much easier if somebody says, spend billions of dollars on this project that will be successful, You can say, okay, we'll do that and we'll leave it in the hands of local people to put the details to it and so forth, you know. And my impression is there's an awful lot of big project aid, development aid, that ends up being largely wasted. On the northern island in Zanzibar, Pemba, I visited a village on somebody else's suggestion actually, but it was somebody else who knew a woman who had been running this, and I believe that it was the Gates Foundation had set up something for millennial villages, and the idea was that if you come in and you put lots of stuff on the ground all at the same time, that'll kind of be the catalyst that will get things going, you know, and you don't have to wait for the next thing each time. And we went to visit this village to find out what happened. We were talking with the emir, the Muslim man who was in charge of the village, and he says basically, well, they built 3 houses here and then they disappeared. He says they didn't finish the houses and they didn't do any of the other stuff that they said was going to happen, and a lot of it I think was just that they never got the local cooperation that they were intending to get. And it was partly because this wasn't the local people's project, it was somebody else's project, right? And they didn't know what it was about or why it was happening the way it was happening. And I do think there's a lot of that goes on. I was just also, there's a book about the corruption levels in Kenya, very interesting book about a man who went off to Britain and revealed a lot of what he knew as insider information about corruption in the Kenyan government. Part of what the author of this book, Michelle Arong of the Financial Times in London, was writing was that she says, you know, like when the aid people come in, they want to please those people that they're working most closely with, and those tend to be the corrupt people in the government, you know, and so they are giving over quite a lot of money to them to administer, and they kind of know that it has to be, this was actually British foreign aid more than it was American, but they know that a lot of this is being skimmed off. But what they're being told to do is let us try to rescue Kenya by sending more money their direction. So they were being told to move a lot of money into Kenya. And that was the way you move a lot of money in, is by giving it to the government there to do what they are doing, and you're aiding their development projects. So, but I do think so that's 2 things. One is that there are sometimes goals there that have to do with moving a lot of money without worrying so much about what the results are. And the other one is just that there are goals that are there that don't have very much to do with what the local people are trying to do. They have more to do with what your expert told you should be doing, right? So it may well be that I'm part of I'm not really much of an expert on a lot of this part of the stuff, but it may well be that my tribe of experts are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I don't know, and I think sometimes that's true, you know. Because we tend to come up with very simple answers to very complicated questions sometimes, you know.
I see the issue from the media perspective, also because you took the topic of dialogue. How much is the dialogue? And so, which leads us to one of the basic points, both of the documentary we are doing, but also of the spirit of Kautilya. That is, when is a communication a dialogue? Because not all forms of communication are a dialogue. And so we could say, what sort of cooperation is a dialogue? And you could say, what sort of relationship, internal and external relationship, is a dialogue? I think that any money that the government spends is the money that you spend for your own people. So the idea of spending money for the development of other people is always something a bit difficult, because surely you are taking money out of the amount of money that you're spending for your people, but you are getting the money from your people. So you need to give explanation for that. You cannot just loot somebody, you loot your taxpayers for the benefit of others. Now, this question is not properly received by the government, it's not properly received by the media, it's somehow covered up and should come more explicit. I think that the public is correct to be skeptic about development aid, because the issue of communication clearly, or why do we do development aid, is not raised. And if that issue is not raised clearly, people is perfectly correct in saying why we should spend. Doesn't matter if it is a big or smaller portion, why we should do it all. And that issue is not clearly set. And I think one of the reasons is the responsibility of the media people themselves. You know, whoever is in power, in not only in democratic countries, especially in democratic countries, but it's always whoever is in power, anyhow has to get the approval of the public. If you're not approved by the public, maybe through election or through other means, you'll get out. So now, to get approval of the public, you need to communicate with the public. Now, media people formally are those responsible of communicating to the public. But formally, in reality, they have their own business. So they communicate to the public what is easier for them to communicate. So they don't take up big headache of communicating to the public the right thing, because they also want to get credit. They want to show up to the public as smart newsmakers. They want to show up to their bosses as those who are able to get a big audience. Now, to tell truth usually may not be the fastest way to get credit, and probably is not the best way to get audience. So you try to please them. And the general presupposition, which I think is wrong, but the general presupposition of the newsmakers is that we get so much respect from our community as much we suspect the others. Like, this is a typical problem, for instance, of Benares. Here you have a strong Muslim community, I have a strong Hindu community. Now, to explain to your community what you should do for the development, what you should do for peace, is very difficult. But to explain to your community how much they should be scared of the other community, that's much easier. You see, oh, see, they are dangerous, they will believe you. No? Much more easy, especially if I create a small problem and say, we must get ready because we may, no, that's much easier. So I get much faster credit from my community if I speak wrong of somebody else's community. It's faster. Now, probably this is not in the interest of my own community, it's in the interest of me. Now, to spread suspect, to spread fear, I'm not serving my community, but I'm serving me, showing up as I'm serving the community. Now, newsmakers do the same. So newsmakers try to get credit from their own audience by sharing suspects, fears, doubts, what do they do, and as a politician, since they have to reach the public, and they have to reach the public through journalism, because that's the way that the communication is set, they are interface, then they end up serving the purpose that the journalists serve, thinking, but which in fact the journalists are setting for themselves. Now, we have, let's go back to so this is a form of communication which is not a dialogue. Journalists surely communicate, but do not enter into dialogue often, neither with their own public, because when you are in a dialogue, you tell the other person, the other counterpart, what you really think, and wait for an answer, but you say what you think. If I tell you what you would like to listen from me, I'm not in a dialogue. Clear? Yeah. So that's not a dialogue approach. It's not a dialogue approach from the government officers, who again are not proposing something. You're saying that you should be frank, you should go to the people with proposal. They're not proposing something. They try to please the public. Actually, no, they try to please the journalist, because that's the way that they can do in order to please the public. So if we portray our national interest or our community interest, which is the same, community with other communities, no? Nation with other nations, as something competitive with the interests of the others, in the source, so we lose game. If they gain, we stand to lose. So we should, not in the win-lose game, like if they have more business, we will have less business. Then you cannot have any other form of development aid as just a way to show up to the other countries something that actually you don't want. Like for instance, you want to influence the governments there, for instance, because you may want contracts in the oil industry. And in order to influence the government there, you bring money, you let them administer, you speak as a foreign aid, but actually you're getting contracts there. That is something that also relatively easy to explain to the public. It's our national interest to get oil contracts there. So let's spend some money for development assistance just to have a make-up that we are smart guys, that we're not corrupting the government officers. It's a way of corrupting them in a more decent, civilized way. We are interested in oil contracts. This is something that probably the public, or at least what the journalists think about the public, will support. If we're entering into issues like instead of global governance, something that we know is in the interest of all communities, but not of one specific community, because it's the interest of everybody. Like for instance, climate change, or like sharing the knowledge, reciprocal education, or as you say, create a better climate of understanding. This is something that is going to benefit the whole community, but not empowering one over the other. This is a shared empowerment, but it's not empowering somebody at the cost of somebody else. Now, this is something that requires a different mentality. That maybe also sometimes politicians would like to do, maybe also journalists would like to do it, but since simply they don't know how to communicate that, because they are so used to communicate in conflicting manner. They are so used to explain the things on the basis of competition and conflict, that whenever there is some work to be done which is beneficial to everybody, they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to present about it. They don't know how to deal about it. They don't know who should approve it. Because you are contributing to something that goes in the benefit of everybody. But you're taking something out of your pocket. It's something like suppose if we are here in a small community. Something like if you say you go into the bathroom and you put it a bit in order, but without anybody looking at you. If everybody were doing, it would be in the interest of everybody. But if you just do it, and the others also don't do it, you're just losing time. So how to do something, how to create trust, that's a very different topic. It's a topic neither politicians nor the journalists are trained to do.
If I, as a citizen of my country, give money to my government, and the government uses the money not for my health or services for my health or education, but to another community for the benefit of everyone, not for my benefit, why should I give the money? That's the approach that people have. But I think a lot of dialogue and competition really get done on ground. I mean, donors give us money in women's empowerment or sustaining livelihoods. And then you as a team which gets the money and implements the project, how do you do it? So if you have if you think it's creating conflict, are you informing the people who give you aid or not? And you as a team, are you finding a way to solve that and maybe to achieve the same indicators that donor governments want, but showing why a different way of implementing it actually will also reach the indicators. So it's not just communication by media, it's also NGOs, how they work on ground. If she has a project on women's empowerment and she says, the way to do women's empowerment in Uttar Pradesh is different from the way to do women's empowerment in Kerala because the education levels are different. And if you don't do it this way, you will not achieve the indicator that you have of women's empowerment. then they'd listen to you also, because they want to achieve that objective, and they will listen to you if you say this is the only way to achieve it. We cannot achieve it otherwise. So it's also, I think, teams which work on ground that create dialogue or create the right perception of why aid is given with certain objectives, and how we can actually also feed the objectives if it's needed, but essentially do what we think is right and bring that across. Because if you bring it across to US aid in India or Europe aid in India, they listen, because it's not that they don't want you to be able to work. They want certain objectives to be achieved, but the way to achieve those objectives is different in different countries. And probably because we need the money of donors as NGOs, sometimes we don't tell them that this is what is really needed, even if it means losing the aid that comes to us.
I am here on funds granted to me by the Indian Sarkari for a period, a span of time, no less than 3 months, no more than a year. My problem is, could these funds be used, employed better in another way than giving money to me? Because I think I am supposed, when I will come back to Italy, to spread Indian culture. And my second issue, question, plea, query is, can this contribute to a dialogue, or is it just a waste of money?
You're doing work on Indian cinema, right? I mean, I can vouch that the Indian cinema is the best ambassador of the Indian culture, because I've been to the remotest parts of countries in Afghanistan, in Africa, and I've found people, they know much more about Indian cinema and Indian culture through the Indian cinema rather than through development aid of any kind. I mean, they don't know much about the American culture, but they know Indian culture because of Indian films. So if you go back to Italy after an experience in India, not just an analysis which is funded of Indian culture or Indian cinema, but a real life experience, and you bring back even to 10 people your experience about how your cultural experience in India has been, it becomes a testimony of dialogue. So I don't think it's a waste. Maybe it could have been employed better.
Yes.
In India itself.
I am sure.
In India itself.
Yes.
But if India says, okay, this is our way, because India now being a more developed country, can say a part of our funds should go in for spreading and sharing our culture. It cannot just do it within India with Indians. It must do it with people outside of India and bring them into this country and give them an experience of this culture for them to take it back. So it's a different kind of cooperation.
I think there cannot be real brotherhood, because the modern perspective is based on individualism. And therefore everyone looks for his own interest. This is what the 17th century economical theory, from self-interest should derive, one doesn't know how, the general interest. So I think this is the one of the flaws of this political theory. So I don't know, someone may explain how it's possible. So the modern states behave like individuals. Everyone looks for its own interest, and its own interest is very often aggressive. So this is the reality. Theory may be different, but as things go today in the world, I think theories are more a cover-up of self-interest than anything else. So people who believe in modernity should try to solve this riddle. People who don't believe in modernity, like me, are disqualified, happily disqualified from this riddle. So
wasn't always like that. Individualism wasn't always at the center. The relationship between the community wasn't always compatible.
In the past, individualism was there, but was not at the center, because higher viewpoints were supposed to happen. So, like religious viewpoint, Where is religion in the modern Protestant lay society? Where is it? I don't know.
Would you want to say that there is a linkage between religion in the sense of spirituality and a more inclusive way of development?
No, I don't understand.
Nel punto che hai fatto, vorresti dire che c'è un link fra la spiritualità di una persona e il desiderio dello sviluppo inclusivo, delle persone.
The idea of development is very typical of this form of civilization. No? So I don't know if I don't think it can be, because what would be meant by development in other was meant as development in other times was spiritual, was not just to some extent material. No? I think in modern society too much importance is given to what is material, what is in the body. You know? Many people think this is important because we can touch and we can sell also. But our thoughts may not be perceived by many people. So this is too much. It is too much and is creating problems in the administration of the world. So this global warming is the direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution. It looks like, no? So one can judge by oneself after 200 years.
What is it that journalists might do that could make it possible for people to see development aid in a better light, to be willing to spend money for somebody else where they weren't sure the benefits were going to come back to them? And I think in some ways we may have been underselling kind of an altruism among populations in some sense. And I'm thinking that when you can put faces on people who are suffering and tell someone what they could do to help, that brings quite a lot of response. Natural disasters bring out huge responses. Unfortunately, they're not very sustainable. I mean, we don't want the disaster to be sustained, but the response is not very sustainable. So the tsunami brought a huge amount of outpouring of money, certainly from people in the United States, and I suspect from throughout the world. The earthquake in Haiti did the same thing, it seems to me, and so there was a lot of outpouring of money, and then it just disappears after a while. But I think that's partly because it gets covered very, very well. You see people who look somewhat like they were living a normal life suddenly stricken by a disaster, and you feel like you want to help. I think that's what's going on anyway. Certainly, my impression is, I don't have numbers for this, but my impression is that a number of groups who raise money for children in poor countries by having the donor adopt a child, and even if the adoption means only, you know, you get a note once in a while with a picture of the child and so forth, you know, that brings out quite a lot of response from people, my impression is. And actually, when I've traveled in Guatemala for a time, and I was running into people in Guatemala who had come down to visit the child they have been supporting there for several years. So I think a lot of it is that what journalists can do is to put a face on to the victims, but at the same time, if this is harder to do, I think, and to show what can be done to help those victims of various kinds of things, including just pure underdevelopment, you know, or oppression of women, or childhood deaths sometimes, you know, poor education, things of that sort. So there's that. Global governance, I've been asked to say something about that. I don't know. I have to say, even when the disaster that appears to be facing us is a global disaster, that is to say global warming, the human capacity for self-deception appears to be very unlimited, right? And so I know of people not close friends of mine, but friends of mine nevertheless, who still don't believe that we have global warming going on, and they're not 100% convinced that even if it is going on, that human activity has had anything to do with it. This may be a peculiarly American phenomenon, I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless, it makes it very hard to sell something that is a global catastrophe as a reason for getting better global governance. And I do think that there's just enough national chauvinism in many of the nations in the world that people are most reluctant to sign on to something that's even further away from them, even less in their direct control, and perhaps even just yet one more huge bureaucracy that you can't do much of anything about. The part of it that says we need to be dialoguing and so forth, I really doubt that anybody objects strongly to that, but I'm not sure that people expect a lot to come out of it. So on that one, it's hard to say. I don't have a strong answer on that one, I think. I think I've touched on most of the things I wanted to touch on. How do you convince people that global governments would be a good idea? In the United States, we're having trouble these days almost convincing people that national governance should be a good idea. I don't know what to say about that one.
Don't you think that part of the problem is newsmaking? Because of this attitude of the journalists to get in Italiano we have avere gli applausi.
Yeah, get a big applause.
Sure. By the public.
Yeah.
And since the easy way out is to speak bad of the others, so to speak bad of governments, to speak bad of politicians, to speak bad of the various forms of intellectuals, seems to be the fastest way to get credit of the people. Then, of course, we will have problems that people say, oh, let's solve it, let's not have governments. You know? And that maybe is not what the journalists wanted to do, but surely it's going to be the consequence of using this shortcut of getting liked by the public by speaking bad of others. Oh, let's do without it. So I think that really I'm convinced, I'm fully convinced that a lot of work that needs to be done in order to create a better say relationship climate has to do with improving a better communication climate.
I have a feeling you're right.
And the news making has done a lot to pollute the communication climate.
Could well be,
Portray itself as the one talking objectively, but actually being servile to the worst kind of appetites of the public. So going into a spiral of descending, abandoning fully the kind of normal responsibility that the intellectual used to have, and which motivated all the democratic processes, maybe it's Italian, but all at least the process of governments as made by intellectual, which acted as interface, actually going into a kind of commerciality or service or political service, which is running after the lowest kind of human appetites. So actively moving the process, which is the opposite of the process of education and self-awareness of empowerment, which is starting from the lowest appetites of the human being, but leading up to more civilized feelings. And this downward trend. This is what to say. How to say it? It's a kind of more what you have in the economy now. Yes, a kind of like we have in the economy the financial. Crunch.
Collapse.
How is it? Crunch.
Crisis, crunch, collapse.
What is crunch? They're called crunch. It's financial crunch. It's been called. Some kind of ethical crunch. Going on in the news making, which is bringing down the communication climate, which is bringing down the relationship climate. Unless all intellectuals, all politicians, all NGOs, all those which are motivated for the community good, take up the issue of improving the communication climate, I think we are destined to have less and less governance, less and less community governance, less and less possibility of managing the things, and so not preventive and not solving all kind of economic, social, and policy and cultural disasters which naturally followed by a polluted communication climate.
Yeah.
I think most of the international development agencies, they want to impose Western values mostly, and the notion of development is Western based, it is mostly a Western notion. And I'm not sure that imposing those Western values will really create peace and harmony within the non-Western countries. And I think it would be much more intelligent to preserve their own heritage, their own culture, their own values. The Indian way of life, the Indian cities, they're beautiful, they're beautiful system, and unfortunately, most of the time, they want to leave this for the Western houses, and they want to destroy old chalk and the old houses in the chalk to build new, completely ugly houses. So I think it's very important to make to make Indians or to make Asians, Africans proud of their own values, own civilization, own culture, and I think it is really missing in international development.
I think what you say is relevant. I would ask you please to explain for the general public, which is the public of the television, a bit better, what you personally, but also generally UNESCO, conceives to be heritage. What do we mean by heritage? And what do you mean by preserving? So how we identify a heritage, and what do we have to do in order to preserve it? What are the challenges that make us thinking that heritage may be lost?
Till now, heritage was mostly conceived as built heritage. And the world heritage was mostly the built heritage, big monuments, very imposing monuments. So people want to preserve them because they are symbolic of the country. They are big symbols of the country. But now there is after much debates, there is a new concept of heritage, which I'm sure you have learned of it, which is intangible heritage. It is not only monuments; it is also culture, traditions, religion, festivals. We have seen that in many cases, the intangible heritage is very much related to the built heritage. For instance, if you destroy old buildings in the old city, also the intangible heritage which is coming with the built heritage will be destroyed, because there will be no more people who are selling in the streets, no more folk arts in the old city. Instead, there will be big roads and big cars. So all this intangible heritage will be destroyed. So I think the first priority is to preserve the built heritage, for instance, in the case of Indian cities, in order to preserve also the other traditions which is coming within this heritage.
What happens with development aid is that the communication does, for instance, it's not an imposing of a Western model when you say preserve heritage. It's also our model to say preserve heritage. The way we preserve heritage is different maybe from the way France preserves heritage.
True, very true.
And it's important to give value to the way we as Indians preserve heritage. And doesn't have to be the French way. It can be our way.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so what also happens is that very often people think that keeping traditions and preserving tradition means keeping you out of development. Yeah, so if you want to progress and you want to improve standards of living of people, you must not keep them in heritage, because when you keep the heritage, you're saying, okay, you should stay there with your traditions, with your buildings. Don't go become modern, but then you would get excluded from the modern amenities, let's say. So it's important to say, no, it's possible to preserve and develop together. You link the two. I think very often people who go against preserving heritage is because they don't see the link between the two also,
Exactly, very strong.
They think it's, keeping your traditions means, okay, you stay in old buildings and have water 2 hours a day and stay there. We want to preserve that because it's different. But it's possible to have water 24 hours and also have the old buildings. You don't have to destroy old buildings to have water 24 hours. We don't want Varanasi, and I'm the first one to say we have to preserve heritage. We don't want Varanasi to become a museum, for instance.
Yeah, it's true.
Which is beautiful, but there's no...
Yeah, you have to be very careful on this. And for instance,
there are cities in Italy which
many French cities also they become museum. There's no life anymore. It's only,
in order to preserve heritage, they kill the life of the Then we no more bathing in the Ganges because the palaces have to be restored and preserved, and ghats must be clean, so no one can...
you're right. You have to be very careful.
You spoke about the point that when disasters happen, you have a lot of people donating money for a short period of time. Now, do you think that people in the Western world have a tendency, and then you talked about the relationship with people, and then people. So do you think that Western people, people who donate money, have a tendency of giving money out of a sense of pittiness and guiltiness to excuse their enjoyment of life, and seeing that other people are not able to have that? So for me to have a dinner at a good restaurant today, in peace after I saw this disaster happening, I feel like going online and donating money so I can peacefully go and have my dinner tonight. Or does the development cooperation need to bring out another reasoning to why we do international cooperation, and not just a sense of pittiness and guiltiness?
You pose that as an either or, and I think it may be both and, you know, in the sense that, yes, I do think that. I sometimes feel it myself, you know. Here I am sitting down for a very nice dinner, and I see on television somebody suffering someplace, you know, and I think, you know, I really should do something about that to balance the scales a little bit better. So I think that's true, you know. But I don't think that's all that goes into it, really, you know. I do also think, whether this is Western or not, I'm not really sure, but I do think that there's probably something built into us psychologically as part of the species that says that when you see someone suffering, and that you do try to extend a hand as well. You know, I think we're evolved as social creatures, and I think that's kind of built into something. Now, I'm speaking way outside of my field, you know, but nevertheless, on the preserving heritage, I had another thing I wanted to say too, you know, and it's kind of like one wants to avoid creating the human zoo, I think is the way I would put it, you know. It's kind of, oh yes, look at these. I mean, these hunting and gathering bands in South Africa, make sure they don't get developed because they would stop hunting and gathering, right? Right? And so how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, right? It used to be said in the United States about people that went off to war, you know. But I think there's some of that, you know, that people, I don't know what, heritage strikes me as something where you say people have to find a way of developing in their own way. You can't preserve everything the way it was 100 years ago. You know, it's not fair to the people that live there, right? Although you may want to preserve parts of it. And with any luck, they would want to preserve parts of it as well, you know. But we can't keep people living in tenements in New York City just because that was traditional at the time, right?